So one point that got obvious for me is I have to find a topic. I cannot just look at serious games in general. It should be important for me to focus on one learning experience. And I think that is just one. And if you ask me why, I would say because I find it interesting and there are a lot of serious games, especially in the games for change, atmosphere that go for that. So I would be very interested. So the patient of the study would be social justice. But I'm quite open to different topics, but I think it should be a topic. I think if I don't get a topic that I particularly could, it could be racism or whatever, it's hard to make a study with that. So just a mini version, social justice in the research today means, before the 70s, teaching for social justice meant, hey, this is the way you should behave, otherwise I would hit you in the face. Or I'd put you in prison, or people were telling you this is what we want from you to think about social justice. It changed a lot, and in the status quo, people say it's about enabling the learner to actively identify social injustice, like just identification, reflect on their own positions about it, and consider consequences of oppression. What are consequences? Be proactive in finding alternative actions, and also put the action in change. So if you look at how people now teach social justice, is they try to develop scenarios where they can teach people to do these points, which means they don't instruct people to be social, they try to give them experiences that enable them to do that. And I think games could be a very interesting environment to allow people to explore for instance, how social injustice can look like, what their position is, what you can do, and they can even try it. So I think it is an interesting space in theory, but what about the practice? So the research question I would have in mind is, what do designers of serious games aim for when designing, aim for social change? Like, what do they think? I would also be interested in what they think learning is. I know it's a bit mean, it's a bit of a killer question from my perspective, but it's interesting for me if somebody designs a game, like what does he think learning is? Because that's what he's designing for. Do interviews with designers, and maybe you have other ideas what to do in that area. Then one idea that I have is looking at different, you saw the Bateson model. You can also analyze games for that. You can see what content do they offer, how do they frame the content, what narratives do they work with, how do the rules, set in with the narratives, and etc. But where is even the invitation for transfer? How did the game do that? And where is an invitation for transformation? As I showed before, it's very hard. But I'm even wondering if there are games that allow that. And so you can analyze games. And the third question I would have, of course, is now, do players of serious games change the way of positioning, thinking, reflecting about social justice? So this would be an empirical study where really we do research on players and how they changed through playing serious games. Fourth question would be, what consequences do the connection? So that's one thing that I found, that a very important aspect, I think, that I really want to put in that research is that I found if you don't have a relation to the problem, if you play Global Conflict Palestine, you can learn a lot about the Palestinian conflict, but if you don't have a connection to your own life, it's very hard that the transformation is kicking in, because why should it? So it would be interesting to also look at people that have issues with social injustice and make them play the games and see what the difference is between, random kids or really people that have an issue in that area. And how do what's the educational support for that? How would it work? What concepts are there? Which settings might work? And what design and experience patterns in games foster or hinder the transformation? So if I have the results, it would be interesting what games on what level make people think about or change the way they think about social justice. So these are the research questions, and I had one, as I said, in terms of cooking or baking, I would say this is one idea that I have, and kind of shows you how early in the stage I am. So I'm sorry, I embarrassed myself now. So I had one idea, for instance, how I could do a qualitative study if we're now talking about player experience, and that would be that I, for instance, give the player, before he plays, a story or a movie or whatever, a movie scene of a social dilemma. So I kind of like give them a dilemma, and I discuss or ask them for their interpretation of the dilemma. And I think there are also some interesting aspects of what you use here, but let's say it's just a story. There are stories, there are typical stories in social science that give you a dilemma where there is not a clear solution, and it makes you kind of like think about it, come up with the ideas. So after that, I would do like interview with them on how they think about it. Let them play a session, a serious game session that is about social justice. And that also means, by the way, that I have to look at all games that are out there that kind of reach that topic. Then, after the play experience, I would like to revisit the story and ask them like what they think about the story now. It could also mean that I give them a different story. I'm not sure about that, but I kind of like the idea that there is a story that they at least can relate to, but it could also be something in real life. But I'm very open about that. And then do the interview about how they think about that and kind of like try to get the relation to the game. So if the game changed their thinking about it. But most importantly, I would like to try in different settings. So informal and formal, which means schools or outside schools, different groups of players, ones that have connection to the problem or no connection, players that are experienced and unexperienced, different age groups, and also with or without educational support. Like is there a teacher that after that game made a session or something, or like was there nothing going on? Open questions, I have like a million. I just put some in here that I would be interested to get your inputs in. First of all, what do you think of the idea? Does it make any sense, like am I following a wrong track here? What further questions would be interesting for you, or pop up? What stays unclear, or where do I need to do more research before I kind of even submit a project idea on that? What methods would be interesting, if you have any ideas on methods, on design, or also working with the players? What games can you think of that hint in that direction? That would be important for me to know. Who could be interested? So if you have any ideas about partners, but also researchers that kind of like are working in that area, or funding possibilities. I have a few funding ideas in mind that I will submit that to, if I come up with an idea. Or yeah, we'll see about that. So, seriously, thank you. Okay, I will go back to the questions.
Do we have readers designated, or is it open to be?
It's totally open. I wanted to write one-page description, ended up to write 12 pages. Found out that I have more gaps in my ideas than answers, and that I kind of made this 2 pages version to give you an idea of what I'm interested in. Yeah?
Comments. One was when you were reviewing the literature that had been written about serious games, whether you looked at games that have some sort of medical approach, because Remission is the one that I'm thinking of specifically, because they were trying to effect a very specific behavioral change that could be measured. I believe it was kids taking their medication. So I'm wondering whether that they had any empirical, qualitative, quantitative even.
Yeah, the Paki and Marlon game is the one that comes to mind, because that was a game that was aimed at Paki and Marlon.
So just so Remission, I think, was the game where I started the whole idea, because Remission was the game that was really researched, in a big scale. Took them 3 years to do that. Mm-hmm. It was just on a quantitative level, which was also interesting for me. So I talked to Lieberman, that did the study, and I asked her for the qualitative study, and she was like, we.
You should check into this, because that was one game that showed results.
Yeah. The funny thing for me is that Remission, for instance, showed, the kids took the medicine, and they found out the main reason is the feeling of self-efficacy. I cannot say efficacy. Self-efficacy was the most important aspect for the kids. Mm-hmm. They felt empowered to do something, so they took the medicine. But if you look at the small lines in the study, it says they also did a study on if the life quality improved, so if the kids got happier. And no, the quality of the life didn't change at all. They just took the medicine again. And I thought something like if we would have a study like that on other games, it would be perfect. But I would also be interested in the quantitative level. Like we hardly know how players we have numbers, and I think they did like a study with I think 1,000 kids, but it's the only study that is really, and it's not about social justice, of course,
Right, of course not.
And what I
It's
also,
about behavioral change.
yes, and the connection to the problem is obvious, I wonder if it's doable to design a game like that, because it's such a cool game. Like, okay, kids don't take medicine, they have cancer, and now the game is relating to that problem, giving them the feeling there's something they can do, and there is something you can test afterwards.
Yeah, and then for this, Packy and Marlin, they had two, but Packy and Marlin was the one that showed the most effective results. And the telling result is that this was done over a whole year, and the visits to the emergency room lowered like 80%, something really crazy, showing that it was really, that there had been a behavioral effect, and it was that kids knew what was good for them and what they should avoid. So at least you have two there. Which takes me to another thing. I mean, one of the problems, I agree that a lot of the problem of serious games is that people seem very comfy and very cozy and saying, oh, but I made this game and this will change people's lives, but really they don't evaluate them directly. But it's also a problem to evaluate it, because in these studies, for example, it was a whole year. And one of the problems is trying to evaluate them. You cannot evaluate behavioral change in a week.
Yeah.
You have to continue doing it. I think that's one of the big challenges of the experiment, that you cannot. It's like those experiments that measure aggression, how violent people get, right after playing a game.
Yeah.
It's like this long, really that doesn't really give results or I don't know.
I think the problem with, how to put this, is that there are lots of studies about games like that, right, where, as Claire said, behavioral change, right, like are people actually doing something different afterwards? And I think the problem with making games for social justice is that so much of the dimensions are not behavioral, right? And especially if you're dealing with kids, when you get to the point where, this is oversimplified, but you make the anti-racism game, and then at the end you go, well, you feel less racist.
Yeah.
Yes. And then they walk out the door, right? And I think what really needs to be established before you could start doing something like this is some sort of rubric, right? Like some sort of way to tell in the end what sort of impact you're having that doesn't rely on self-reporting, right? Or
some metric to count.
Yeah, and of course that was kind of when I went to do that game jam at BBN when I first started here, they wanted to make a game to help soldiers in combat zones in other cultures be more culturally sensitive. And that was the question that kept coming up, right? It's like, when we're done, how do you say, well, do you feel more culturally sensitive? I guess. So I feel like that there not being, sorry, like it's your fault. You personally did not create. I think there not having been an established rubric for going, or metric, sorry, words, for figuring out if you had the impact you're looking for is a major stumbling block.
Yeah.
And all of the ones we have are so imperfect.
I totally agree. What I find interesting so first of all, I totally agree. Like, just, of course. I find it interesting that if you look at the studies that transformative learning people did, like they did millions, but they had like 40 studies where they really looked for transformative learning experiences, not just on a behavioral level, but really how people changed fundamentally. But that means, that comes back to the studies are like, we're talking about 3 years or something, where people are, for instance, I find it, if I give them something to, are you a racist, yes or no? Yeah. But the question is, if I can define a method where I do like interviews and really reach them on a very deep level and do that even over time, it's still very, like, I don't really know the solution yet, you know, I don't have the method. But I think I would like to try to develop one and you know, test it. I think it's, for me, it appears worth trying it. If we don't try it, like, then, you know, like, this means that people will design like thousands of serious games without, you know, like, we just go, yeah, you know, we can study. But it's tricky, totally agree. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about experimental design stuff. And it seems to me, just say that you did have a setup that you introduced,
Yeah.
that it's not so clear, like, what the fact that the learning tool or the learning
Yeah.
thing is a game matters. Like whether
Yeah.
if the material were presented to them in some other way, they would learn regardless, right?
Yeah.
Or they would have that kind of change. So I think part of what the interesting thing that the serious games movement is claiming, or the feeling that I get, is that it's a more effective way of teaching
Yeah.
people. Like it's not just that you could watch a movie about social injustice in Palestine, or you could play a game and there would kind of be roughly equivalent, but rather that there's something which is core about the experience of playing it that kind of gives you this more this sense of involvement, which then is supposed to be more effective as a transformative
Yeah.
learning tool, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like you're probably going to want at least 3 conditions. One where it's baseline, you don't use any learning tool, right? So basically it's just, what do you think about these particular social justice issues?
Yeah.
Then the other one is you present with the serious game, and then the last one is you have some other exercise which is related to social justice. And then you have
Like a documentary or...
it could be a documentary, or it could be a chapter in a textbook, it could be any of those things, right? So, I mean, I guess
Yeah.
the idea would be to have, like, comparing against the baseline of whatever it is that is the standard in teaching at the time. You know, it kind of makes it a more compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the one that I made, that you need a control group
Mhm.
really to do this. And
I like the idea of looking at the standards of teaching, because the problem is, again, you know, like it always goes on, and then before you compare in different media forms. But I like the idea of saying, what is the standard of how do you normally teach that? And now we try something different, and you know, like not me saying this, you know, like I take this really fancy documentary. Let's see what the teacher would use, and then compare it.
So then that also becomes problematic, because I seem to remember that in learning studies, just the sheer novelty of a thing can make it
Yeah.
a more effective tool. So it may not necessarily be the case that a game is a really good tool.
Yeah.
It may just be the case that a game is novel.
Yeah.
So you could get them to take part in like improvisational drama, which they would not have done before, and it would be a more effective something just because it's novel, right? And so it doesn't necessarily say anything about the quality of the game.
Yeah. Just to give you an idea, because in the beginning I thought, okay, this is so tricky, you know, and then I talked to these people in Harvard about experimental design, and this woman would come up to me and say, oh, it's so easy, you know, you just take, how do you say, if you're fantasizing about like words, so what's the definition? So you 10 verbs about social justice, and then 10 verbs after the experiment. And I said, like, excuse me, like, and she said, yeah, that's what we do. Like that's what most people do. They you know, but I said, like, guys, but we don't really reach. But she said, yeah, but you can measure an outcome. And I was just surprised how quick she was with the solution. She was like, come on, that's like